Michael Yardney, and welcome to another Ask the Experts question. This week, my guest expert is Ken Race, Director of Metropole Wealth Advisory. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Michael.
Now, Ken, I know your team's involved in helping your clients grow, protect and pass on their wealth, but today I'd like to have a bit of a talk about something that's near and dear to a lot of property investors' hearts, making the most of legal tax loopholes to be able to save tax, but also to structure their assets to protect them from predators and I guess to pass them on to the future. So I know one of the common questions I'm asked, and I bet you're asked also, is which asset structures are right for me? What should I buy? My properties in my own name, in joint names, in trusts, in my super fund. So we've discussed the various structures before. More importantly though, Ken, today, let's talk about the common mistakes you see people make when structuring their assets.
Yes, that's a very good point to focus on. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is they don't start with the end in mind. So they actually make the mistake almost before they start. They don't even get the horse to the starting gate. So what you've got to do is you've got to have this discussion with your advisor before you buy, because whatever structure you'll end up deciding to use, that has to be set up and agreed on so that you can actually sign a contract of sale, because to get out of a contract and re-sign may not be appropriate, may not be possible, or worse still, might cost you a second stamp duty.
Ken, I think the other part of that, of course, is that the finance has got to be in the right name as well. And we've occasionally seen people who've gone off, bought a property in their own name, got a finance in their name and said, oh, actually, can I put it into a trust now? Too late, isn't it?
Correct. And that's all part of that due diligence on what structure will you use. And you've really got to have, can I say, almost a plan B, because as you said, the most appropriate structure you may not be able to get finance for. So then you've got to go to something else, but understand why you're doing that and the ramifications.
So I think one of the other points, Ken, is that you said at the beginning, begin with the end in mind, because what's it going to be like at the end? Are you going to have a substantial portfolio? Are you going to want to pass it on to your kids? And if that's the intention, sometimes those long-term goals will override the short-term issues of owning things in certain structures where you may or may not get the negative gearing benefit, you may or may not get the tax benefit in the short term, but the long-term goals will override that.
Correct. So it's a cost and benefit analysis. So as an accountant, that's words that are dear to my mind. So as you say, sometimes there's a little bit of a short-term pain, but for the significant benefit moving forward. So I don't like to use the word loopholes. Really, it's using the legislation to your best advantage. And we don't enter anything trying to get the least advantage. And the tax system, the law system, everything is the same.
Sure. And I think it's got to be clear that this isn't specific tax advice we're giving today. And we're definitely not saying to get into any of these things to minimize tax because that's actually illegal and it's the wrong reason to do it. If people buy just for negative gearing benefits or just for this benefit, it's the wrong intention. The best intention, of course, is to have a long-term asset accumulation plan to build your asset base so one day you can live off it, and then you build the right structures, get the right finance to allow you to do that.
Correct, because any investment has got one primary, if you like, requirement, and that is to make money. So it's not to be penalized. So having said that, there are some typical, can I say, quite frequent mistakes that we see people make, and they tend to be repeating. It's the same mistakes made by a variety of people. So probably the first one is, as we said, they don't start with the end in mind, and therefore they don't think of the long-term benefits of what they're trying to achieve to then decide what structure to use today. So one of the more typical mistakes I see is that a couple will buy that investment property in their joint names. And by that I mean they put the two names on the contract. And while they're both working, they could be earning good incomes, reasonable incomes. They think that's the way to buy it so that they can share, if you like, the tax benefits. But what that does is it means that each person is responsible for 100% of the loan, but they're only getting the benefit of half the property. So it's called joint and several responsibility. So it reduces the overall borrowing capacity of that family unit, and therefore that will restrict their wealth accumulation in the future.
And that's particularly important today in this slightly stricter lending climate, isn't it?
Correct. I mean, the second person can obviously still go co-guarantor, they can still give other assets as security, but one person, one loan, that means you have 100% of the debt, but 100% of the asset. So all other things then are equal. It allows then the second person to buy the second property and get that benefit of the improved borrowing capacity.
Okay, so the first common mistake you see is people buying it jointly, which seems to be the logical thing to do, but it's not necessarily correct. What's the second big mistake?
The second mistake is they buy in a personal name because they think that's the easiest thing. It's maybe the least costly for administration, for compliance, when a trust would have been a more appropriate vehicle or structure for them in their particular circumstances. So they immediately jump to a personal name. Sometimes that's an issue with the finance person they've gone to see. They don't go to a finance strategist. They'll go to their local bank officer, and that's the easiest for the bank, not necessarily the best for you as the investor.
Sure. So when you get involved in property, you really should have a team of advisors with various disciplines around you to help you, or I guess a team like yours at Metropole Wealth Advisory that has the property, the financial planning, the finance, the tax, the structuring, the asset protection individuals as part of your big team.
Correct, because what's they saying, you know, the sum of the parts is more than the individual components. Hopefully I've said that right. That's the benefit of having that holistic team adding value to your overall, if you like, investment strategy.
So mistake number 2 is buying in your personal name because it's easy rather than trusts.
Correct.
Mistake number 3, Ken?
They use the wrong trust. It's quite a common mistake. A trust, there is no standard set of words for a trust. It's like saying, I've bought a car. Well, what type of car? What did you need it for? So you've got to get down to the specifics. One of the very common mistakes with the wrong trust is people will go to their advisor and say, oh, look, I'm interested in asset protection. I'm in a particular profession that tends to be litigated against. And they get advised to put the property in the family trust. The problem with a family trust is if you're on wages, you can't claim the negative gearing, that is the loss between the rental income and your expenses, against your wages. But the bank still wants to get paid, so you're funding the cost with after-tax money, which, you know, is a good way not to create wealth.
So I know your team has various trusts, some for families, some for business owners, certain for professionals. And I know within trusts, there are lots of different nuances as well. That's really the topic of a whole different discussion. So let's leave that for another quick discussion another time, Ken. But I think the point you're making is make sure that you have an advisor who's well versed in the various sorts of trusts. The next mistake you see people make, Ken?
They don't link the debt structure with the investment structure. It's called the purpose of the loan. So we've seen a lot of people create debt against different names than what the property ownership is in. And the ATO then will immediately say, but what was the debt for? Was it used for that investment purpose? And unless it's very clear, you will get your interest deduction denied. So the purpose of the loan is very critical to link that loan structure with the investment structure, so that there's a direct line between what you borrowed the money for, and more importantly, the names on the loan compared to the names on the property title.
These are things most investors, most finance people don't even think about.
They don't think about it because a lot of people, unfortunately, go for the easiest solution. But you've got to keep in mind it's the easiest solution for them, not necessarily for you. The problem is a lot of these mistakes are avoidable. Going and just spending a little bit of time with your advisor means that you don't get put into this position where you're actually defeating the purpose of your investment.
Great. So Ken, I asked you for the 5 top mistakes people are making when they buy investments, particularly with regard to structuring. So what's the 5th one?
The 5th one is in relation to an expense that, can I say, is dear to my heart because I dislike it so much, and that's called land tax.
That's a wealth tax, isn't it? It really hurts.
Oh, it's depending on the state, you're effectively paying for the property a second time, maybe over half the lifetime of the property. So it is a wealth tax. And unfortunately, because it's a percentage in most cases, it's not restricted to inflation. The government will just increase its tax base, but that's another topic. So a lot of people then, again, when they've bought in multiple names, call it the family unit, that multiple name only gets one land tax benefit threshold, as opposed to one individual buying it and getting their own individual threshold, and then the second property bought in the second individual's name to get a second threshold. So buying in multiple names can actually cost you a lot more in relation to your land tax. There's some states as well that will actually give you multiple land tax thresholds if you buy in different structures. So each structure would get their own land tax threshold. So that's got to be weighed up against, in some states, you pay a little bit more land tax in a structure, but you've got to weigh it up the long-term benefits, because land tax, after all, is a deductible expense and it is a cost of doing business.
Sure. So you don't get buy in the wrong locations or in a different state just to save land tax. And I've heard of people saying, I don't want to buy any more properties, I don't want to pay land tax. That's silly. It is a cost of doing business. But if you can structure yourself correctly by getting advice up front, that makes a lot of sense, because land tax is an ongoing thing. So you have to pay it every year. So the once-off cost of advice seems to be covered pretty well if you get the right advice. I know a lot of clients who come to Metropole Wealth Advisory initially think, gee, I've got to pay a little bit for advice. Should I? Is it worth it? But I know once they've actually come and seen you and the team, they've found that it's given them clarity of their structures moving forward, a better understanding of what's going on, asset protection, and they feel a lot better for it. And they've actually found that it's a investment, not a cost. Interestingly, most successful investors I come across pay for advisors, are happy to do that, see it as an investment, while the average Australian doesn't have advisors at all, or their advisors are their mates or the guys in the pub. So Ken, if our listeners would like to get in contact with you and see you personally to get advice on their structuring, what should they do? Okay, so try to make it fairly easy for you. Go to the Metropole website, metropole.com.au, and then go to the tag for Metropole Wealth Advisory, and then that'll lead you through the process. Thanks, Ken. So we've just covered the 5 common mistakes property investors make in structuring. Ken, I'd like you to come back again shortly so we can actually discuss the 5 common mistakes you see investors make in their self-managed super funds. Love to. Thank you, Michael.